I had just returned from a night out at sea, the kind of night where the stars hid behind a blanket of clouds and the water was more restless than usual. The gulls were already circling the docks, waiting for scraps, when I cut the engine and let the boat drift into its slip. My back ached from hauling nets, but there was a good catch in the hold. Fish meant money, and money meant another month of bills paid. I had no idea, then, that it would be the last, normal, day of my life. The boat's little radio crackled to life as I began coiling the ropes. Normally, I kept it tuned to the weather reports and maritime warnings, but that morning a frantic voice came through, shattering the usual dull static. Repeat, all citizens are advised to avoid contact with infected individuals. The situation is escalating quickly. Stay inside your homes and await further instructions. The voice was sharp with fear, the kind of fear you don't hear on official broadcasts. I froze, rope dangling from my hands, and turned up the volume. Symptoms include aggression, violent behavior, and unresponsiveness to pain. If attacked, do not engage. Authorities are overwhelmed. Lock your doors. Stay armed if possible. More updates to follow. My mouth went dry. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding like I'd just been caught in a storm. My first thought wasn't the catch in the hold, or the money, or even myself. It was my family. I dropped the rope and sprinted off the deck, boots slapping against the worn wood of the pier. The streets were already chaotic when I drove back into town. Horns blared, people ran aimlessly, and I could hear distant screams that made my gut twist. My old truck rattled as I pushed it faster, weaving between cars stuck at intersections. Home wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive from the harbor on a good day. Today, it felt like an eternity. I pulled into the driveway with tires squealing, nearly clipping the old mailbox. The front door burst open before I'd even reached it. My wife, Aisha, stood there, our daughter clinging to her waist. Her nurse's scrubs were smeared with what looked like dried blood, but her eyes burned with urgency, not pain. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's real, it's everywhere. They said the hospitals are overrun. People are turning, they don't stop." Behind her, my father emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag that smelled of grease and steel. He had been working in his small backyard workshop when the news broke, I could tell. His old eyes were hard, not panicked, though his jaw was tight. "We need to move, boy," he said. "This house won't hold. Your boat, does it have enough fuel?" I nodded. The boat, it was the only option that made sense. Out on the water, away from the streets, we might stand a chance. We didn't waste time. Years of fishing taught me the value of quick action. I barked out a plan, and everyone moved like a crew on deck. Aisha grabbed medical supplies from her nurse's bag. Bandages, antiseptic, antibiotics, syringes. Everything she could stuff into a duffel. She had seen enough horror in the hospital to know what we'd need. My father stormed into his workshop, grabbing tools, hammers, wrenches, and a heavy steel crowbar. "These will have to do until we get something better," he muttered, strapping the crowbar to his belt. I raided the pantry and basement. Canned goods, bottled water, fishing knives, spare batteries, a camping stove, we packed them all into crates. My daughter, Lena, only 12 years old, helped carry lighter bags, her small face pale but determined. I wanted to tell her it would be all right, but the lie caught in my throat. By the time we loaded the truck, the distant screams had become closer, sharper, and unmistakable. The first one we saw staggered at the end of the street. At first glance, it looked like an injured man, bloodied and limping. But when he turned his head toward us, the way his jaw hung slack and his eyes rolled white made my stomach lurch. His clothes were torn, his arm twisted at a wrong angle, yet he kept moving, dragging himself forward with jerky, unnatural strength. Aisha gasped. My father swore under his breath. "Get in the truck," I shouted. We piled inside, slamming the doors just as the thing let out a guttural moan that made my skin crawl. Two more appeared from between houses, running now, faster than seemed possible. I jammed the keys into the ignition and floored it. The truck roared down the street, narrowly avoiding a collision with a panicked driver swerving the other way. My daughter screamed as something slammed against the tailgate, a clawing hand reaching through the open bed before it fell away into the road. "Don't look back," I yelled, though I myself couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, heart-hammering. The drive to the harbor was a gauntlet of chaos. Cars smashed into light poles, people screamed from rooftops, and smoke rose in the distance. At one intersection, a crowd swarmed around a bus, pulling passengers out through the windows. I steered onto the sidewalk to avoid it, tires bouncing over the curb as my father gripped the dashboard with white knuckles. "Keep your eyes forward," he barked. "We'll make it, just get us there." When the harbor finally came into sight, I felt a surge of desperate relief. My boat was still there, rocking gently in its berth as if nothing had changed, as if the world wasn't crumbling. But even here, the infection had spread. A fisherman I recognized staggered along the dock, face gray, mouth gnashing. Another figure lunged at him from behind, sinking teeth into his shoulder. The man screamed, high and pitiful, before both tumbled into the water. I slammed the truck to a stop near the pier. "Grab everything. Move, move." We scrambled to unload, hauling crates and bags toward the boat. My father swung his crowbar at a figure that lurched too close, the steel crunching against bone with a sickening crack. He didn't pause, didn't flinch, just swung again until the thing fell. Aisha shepherded Lena onto the deck, then threw the supplies after her. I followed last, heart pounding as I yanked the mooring lines free. The infected fisherman had resurfaced, thrashing toward us with jaws snapping. I shoved off with a pole just as he reached the pier, his fingers scraping wood. The engine coughed, then roared to life beneath my hands. The boat surged forward, leaving the dock behind. When we anchored a kilometer offshore, the city stretched before us like a nightmare painting. Flames licked the skyline, sirens wailed, then sputtered into silence. From this distance, the moans carried faintly over the water, blending with the cries of the gulls. The streets looked like rivers of panic, people scattering, fighting, being dragged down. Lena pressed her face into Aisha's shoulder, sobbing softly. My father stood at the bow, jaw set, crowbar still in his hands. Aisha wrapped an arm around both of them, her eyes wet but fierce. And me? I sat at the tiller, staring at the city I had known all my life, now torn apart. My boat had always been a place of work, of sweat and fish and long nights under the stars. Now it was our ark, a fragile shell of wood and steel floating in a sea of death. I didn't know how long we could last out here. I didn't know if anywhere was safe anymore. But I knew this. We were together, and we were alive. And as long as I had breath in my body, I would fight to keep it that way. The first night on the water was the longest of my life. We had anchored about a kilometer offshore, close enough to see the burning city skyline but far enough that the screams and chaos blurred into the sounds of waves. I didn't sleep, none of us did. Aisha sat below deck with Lena, whispering soft words to calm her, though I could hear the trembling in her voice. My father leaned against the railing, crowbar across his lap, watching the city as if sheer willpower could hold back the madness spreading through it. I stayed at the tiller, hands tight on the wheel even though the boat wasn't moving. Every creak of wood, every splash against the hull made my heart leap. The horizon glowed red from the fires. The air smelled of salt mixed with smoke, and sometimes, when the wind shifted, I could swear I heard the moans drifting across the water. It felt like the city was alive, breathing out fear and death. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavy, but daylight brought a false sense of safety. The gulls still circled, calling for scraps. The water still glistened like it always had. For a moment, I almost believed it was just another fishing trip, that I'd soon haul in nets and sell at the market. Then I saw the smoke rising from the hospital where Aisha worked, and the illusion crumbled. We rationed breakfast, canned beans warmed on the camping stove. Lena ate in silence, eyes distant, and I forced myself to smile at her though I could barely swallow. My father, practical as always, started making a list of supplies we had and what we'd need to last. Food and water were limited. Fuel was worse. We couldn't stay offshore forever without restocking. The thought of going back to land twisted my stomach, but there was no choice. The second night, things changed. We were dozing in turns when the sound came, splashing, faint at first. I thought it was fish bumping the hull. But then came a thud, followed by the unmistakable scrape of fingernails on wood. My father reacted first, swinging his lantern over the side. What the light revealed froze me in place. A man clung to the boat's edge, or what used to be a man. His skin was pale, shredded around the face as if eaten. His eyes rolled up, milky white, and his jaw snapped open and shut like a broken hinge. He had swum, God knows how, from the shore. Now he clawed at our boat with unholy strength, pulling himself upward. Lena screamed from below deck. Aisha grabbed her, shielding her eyes. My father didn't hesitate. With a grunt, he swung the crowbar down, smashing it into the creature's skull. There was a sickening crack, and the body slipped back into the dark water, leaving only ripples and red foam. I stood frozen, gripping the wheel with shaking hands. The sea had always been my refuge, a place where the worst danger was a storm. But now even here, death had found us. After that, we doubled our watch. My father and I took shifts, crowbar and boat hook always ready. The fear of more swimmers kept us awake. Every shadow beneath the surface looked like a body. Every wave felt like hands reaching for us. On the third day, supplies forced our hand. We had water for maybe 3 more days, food for a little longer if we stretched it. Fuel was down to half a tank. The thought of going back ashore gnawed at me, but I knew if we stayed out here with nothing to drink, we'd die slower than the city was killing its people. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe the chaos had burned out. Maybe some neighborhoods were still holding. Maybe we could slip in, take what we needed, and get back out. The lies almost worked. We agreed to land at dawn, when the streets might be quieter. I steered us toward the marina on the east side, an area less dense than the central harbor. As the boat drifted closer, the reality hit harder. Cars were abandoned at awkward angles, smoke curled from ruined shops, and blood streaked the pavement in lines and pools. No people, no voices. Just silence broken by the occasional gull. I tied us loosely to a cracked concrete pier, heart hammering. Quick, I told them. In and out. Aisha nodded, clutching her bag of medical supplies close. My father hefted his crowbar. Lena begged to come, but I told her firmly she had to stay on the boat. Her tears nearly broke me, but I couldn't risk her. We moved fast, ducking into a small grocery with shattered windows. Inside, the stench hit us, rot, blood, and something fouler. The shelves were ransacked, but we scavenged what was left. Cans, bottled water, a few bags of rice. I found a box of fishing hooks and line in the hardware section, shoved them into my pack. Aisha grabbed medicine from the pharmacy corner, painkillers, antiseptics, gauze. We were almost done when the sound came. Not one, but many. Shuffling, dragging feet, then low guttural moans. My father's hand tightened on the crowbar. Aisha's face went white. They poured from the back hallway, 6, maybe more. Their clothes torn, their bodies broken, yet they moved with that relentless hunger. One woman's jaw hung by a strip of flesh, swinging loose as she lunged forward. Move, I yelled. We shoved through the front, the glass crunching under our boots. The moans grew louder, closer. My father swung once, sending one sprawling, but more came. Aisha nearly tripped with her pack, and I hauled her up by the arm. The boat was in sight when the first one reached me, grabbing my jacket. I spun, slammed a fist into its face, but it barely slowed. My father's crowbar came down again, splitting its skull. He roared like a man 30 years younger, shoving me toward the pier. We ran, throwing the supplies aboard. I shoved Aisha in first, then scrambled after her. My father swung one last time before leaping onto the deck, crowbar dripping. I cut the rope, fired the engine, and we tore away from the pier as the infected hurled themselves into the water after us. This time, I didn't stop until we were 3 kilometers out, the city a smudge of smoke on the horizon. I cut the engine, my chest heaving. We had supplies, yes, but at a cost. Aisha's hands trembled as she tried to calm Lena, who cried into her mother's chest. My father sat at the bow, crowbar across his knees, staring at nothing. I tried to steady my breathing, but my hands shook too much to hide. The truth had set in. The sea wasn't safe. The land wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. But we were still alive. And as long as this boat floated, as long as I had breath, I'd fight to keep us that way. The days blurred together after our desperate run from the shore. We floated far enough out that the city was just a dark smudge across the horizon, the fires reduced to faint glows at night. But even out here, there was no peace. The sea had always been my ally, but now it felt like an accomplice to our isolation, cutting us off from everything except hunger and fear. We rationed the food carefully. A can of beans could feed all four of us if stretched with rice. Water was harder. We were drinking less than half of what we needed. Every sip felt like betrayal, knowing it left less for tomorrow. My father and I tried fishing with lines over the side, but the sea mocked us. The fish weren't biting, or maybe I was too clumsy from exhaustion. Either way, the nets came back empty, and our bellies stayed hollow. The boat rocked constantly, the waves never letting us forget how small we were. Nights were worst. Lena cried softly, muffling her face in Aisha's lap so as not to wake us. But we were already awake. My father and I took turns on watch, listening for splashes, for the scrape of hands against the hull. We hadn't seen another swimmer since that first night, but the memory haunted us. By the fifth day, tension on the boat was thick as smoke. My father grumbled that we couldn't stay out here forever. Aisha argued that going ashore again was suicide. I sat in the middle, gripping the wheel like it could anchor me in their storm. Lena watched us all with wide, frightened eyes. She was too young for this kind of fear. She should have been worried about homework or friends, not whether her father could keep her alive. That night, while the others tried to sleep, I stood at the stern and stared at the horizon. The city glowed faintly under the stars, still burning. My hands shook as I lit a cigarette from the emergency pack hidden in my tackle box. The smoke stung my lungs, but it gave me something to focus on besides the gnawing hunger. That was when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just a flicker, maybe a reflection. But no, it was real. A flashlight, moving in bursts, about half a kilometer away, closer to shore. I squinted, heart hammering. Someone else was out here. Another boat. Another family, maybe, or maybe worse. I didn't say anything right away. I watched the light move, then vanish, then reappear. Whoever they were close enough to see us too if they were looking. A chill crawled up my spine. Out here, surrounded by water, humans could be just as dangerous as the dead. The next morning, we knew for sure we weren't alone. A small motorboat appeared on the horizon, heading our way. It was old, rusty, barely afloat, but it carried 4 men. Rough-looking, sunburnt, clothes torn, eyes hollow. They waved at first, calling out, their voices carrying over the water. Hey there. We just need some food, please. Aisha looked at me, her face pale. My father gripped his crowbar tighter. I didn't answer. I just watched them, heart pounding. The men drew closer, too close, their boat bumping against ours. One of them jumped across without waiting for permission, landing on our deck with a grin that showed too many teeth. His breath stank of rot and salt. What have you got, friend? He asked, his voice smooth but dangerous. Just a little to share. We're all in the same storm, right? My father stepped forward, crowbar raised. Back on your boat. His voice was steady, but I saw the tightness in his jaw. The man's grin faltered, replaced by something harder. His companions climbed aboard too, 3 of them now standing in our space, their eyes darting to the crates of supplies. Aisha pulled Lena behind her, shielding her with her body. I grabbed the boat hook and leveled it like a spear. My voice cracked with anger. I said, "Back on your boat." One of them laughed, low and cruel. "Or what, fisherman, you'll gut us like a catch." He lunged at me. Instinct took over. I thrust the hook forward, catching him in the chest and shoving him back against the railing. My father swung his crowbar, the steel crunching against another man's shoulder with a sickening crack. Aisha screamed, clutching Lena as the boat rocked violently with the struggle. The man I shoved pulled a knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the morning sun as he slashed at me, missing by inches. Rage boiled in my chest. This was my boat, my family, my only chance at survival. I roared and drove the hook into his stomach, forcing him back until he toppled overboard with a splash. The others froze for a moment, eyes wide, before panic took them. My father swung again, breaking the arm of the second intruder, who howled and stumbled back to their boat. The last man hesitated, then jumped after him. They scrambled aboard their rusty vessel, cursing, shouting threats as they fumbled with the engine. I stood there, chest heaving, knuckles white on the boat hook. My hands shook, my stomach churned, but I kept my eyes on them until their boat turned and limped back toward shore. Only then did I collapse against the railing, trembling. Aisha rushed to me, her eyes wide with fear and relief. "You're bleeding," she cried. I glanced down, just a shallow cut across my arm where the knife had grazed me. She pressed a cloth against it, her hands firm, steady despite the tears in her eyes. Lena stared at me like she didn't recognize me. My father sat down heavily, crowbar across his knees, his breathing ragged. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. The dead were not the only danger anymore. The next few days blurred into a haze of salt, sweat, and fear. Our boat had become our entire world, the only place where we felt some semblance of safety. Every splash in the water, every distant cry from the city, set my heart racing. The food we had scavenged was already dwindling, and water rationing made even the smallest tasks a chore. Aisha tried to keep Lena occupied with stories or songs, but her daughter's eyes were wide and wary, scanning every shadow for threats. My father, usually calm and unshakable, had become quiet, brooding over the supplies and the boat's weaknesses, muttering plans to reinforce rails or build makeshift weapons. By the 7th day, the rationing and stress were taking their toll. Lena had stopped laughing entirely, her small body curled against her mother whenever we stopped moving. Aisha herself was pale and thin, but she hid it, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Lena. I couldn't stop myself from staring at her, my heart breaking for the girl and the woman who had always been my anchor. We had to go back to shore. There was no other choice. Our water was nearly gone, and our food supply had dwindled to a few cans and the last of the rice. I plotted a course to a quieter part of the harbor, hoping the chaos had moved elsewhere. My father double-checked the harpoons, axes, and crowbar, while Aisha prepared medical supplies and made sure the life jackets were ready. Lena sat quietly, clutching a small blanket, her head resting against her mother's shoulder. As we approached the harbor, I scanned the water for movement. Nothing. Just the occasional gull and the glint of sunlight on waves. It was eerily calm. Too calm. We tied the boat to a small, abandoned pier and slipped quietly onto the docks. The streets were nearly empty, littered with debris, overturned carts, broken signs, and abandoned vehicles. Smoke curled in the distance from buildings that had burned for days. The stench of decay filled the air. We moved quickly, keeping our heads low. Aisha clutched her bag of medical supplies, my father carried his crowbar, and I kept the boat hook ready. The small grocery store we aimed for was silent when we entered. Shelves were picked clean, but some cans and bottled water remained. I grabbed everything we could carry, stuffing bags full while my father kept watch. Then we heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, scraping along the cracked tile floor. We froze. Through the doorway came two of them, shuffling with the unmistakable jerky movements of the infected. Their eyes rolled back, their mouths hung slack, drool dripping. One lunged at us. My father swung the crowbar and struck it in the head, the body crumpling with a sickening thud. The second one followed, hands outstretched, moaning. Aisha swung a metal rod she had grabbed from the hardware section, catching it across the back. It went down, but not without grabbing her sleeve, ripping the fabric. She hissed in pain, but she didn't falter. We ran. Bags of food and water clutched tight. We made it back to the boat as the last of the undead clawed at the doors. I shoved off, cutting the rope with a knife and firing the engine. The waves threw us side to side as we put distance between ourselves and the docks. The city behind us was silent again, except for the distant moans carried faintly over the water. For the next day, we floated in tense silence. Every shadow in the water seemed to hide a threat. Every distant sound made us jump. I slept for only short bursts, always returning to the wheel, scanning the horizon for anything that moved. My father repaired minor damage to the railings and reinforced the sides of the boat. Aisha tended to small scratches and bruises, checking Lena's forehead for fever and comforting her when she whimpered. Then came the second boat. A small vessel, barely visible at first, approached silently. There were people aboard, their faces desperate, eyes wild. I grabbed the binoculars and studied them. They were gaunt, clothed in rags, and they were waving frantically. My stomach twisted. Supplies, one of them shouted. We just need food and water. Please, we don't have anything left. Aisha grabbed my arm. We can't give them everything. We won't survive. I nodded, feeling the weight of every ration we had left. My father stepped forward, crowbar ready. We do what we have to. Don't let them board. The boat drew closer, and one of them jumped aboard without hesitation, landing heavily on our deck. The others followed. My heart raced as we fought. Crowbars, boat hooks, metal rods, anything that could fend them off became a weapon. One of the men lunged at me, knife flashing, but I hooked him with the pole and threw him overboard. Another swung at my father, who met him with a crushing blow from the crowbar. The fight was brutal, each second stretching into eternity. I could hear Aisha shouting, Lena screaming, my father grunting with effort. Bodies fell, some into the water, some against the railings, until the last of them scrambled back to their boat, retreating into the distance. We were shaken, covered in sweat and grime, hearts pounding in unison. No one spoke for several minutes. Only the waves lapping against the hull filled the air. Aisha held Lena tightly, whispering soft reassurances. My father sat down heavily, crowbar across his knees, his breathing ragged. I stared at the horizon, wondering how many more humans would test us before this nightmare ended. The fight had left us exhausted and vulnerable, but there was one sliver of hope. The city in the distance seemed calmer now, less smoke rising. Perhaps the worst had passed. Perhaps there were still areas untouched. Perhaps survival was possible. I didn't dare speak it aloud. Instead, I tightened my grip on the wheel, staring at the endless horizon. The water stretched forever, dark and uncertain. But for the first time in days, I allowed myself to hope. We had survived the dead, we had survived the living. And as long as we kept fighting together, we could survive whatever came next. The next few days at sea were tense, every moment a test of nerves. After the attack from the other humans, we were on edge, scanning the horizon constantly, checking the water for signs of the dead or the desperate. Supplies were critically low. Every meal was rationed with precision, every sip of water measured. Aisha grew paler by the day, her hands trembling as she prepared meals, and Lena clung to her mother like a shadow. My father, ever practical, reinforced the railings and made sure every tool we had was ready as a weapon. Then the storm hit. It started as a low wind, a gentle warning across the waves. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled in fast, dark and heavy. The water turned from steel gray to black, waves growing taller, sharper, tossing our small boat like a toy. I fought to keep the engine steady, the wheel jerking under my grip. Lena screamed when a wave slammed against the side, water spraying into the cabin. Aisha held her tight, wrapping blankets around both of them, her face pale but determined. The wind howled, whipping salt and rain into our faces. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sea for a brief moment. And then I saw them. Bodies floating in the waves, the dead that had been left behind in the harbor, drifting closer. Their arms reached out of the water, jaws snapping, eyes rolling. The storm made it almost impossible to steer around them. Stay down, I shouted over the roar of wind and thunder. My father grabbed the harpoon and a boathook, scanning for the nearest threat. We had to fend them off as the waves slammed us. Every strike was a mixture of adrenaline and terror. One crashed against the hull, and my heart leapt into my throat as the wood groaned under its weight. The storm lasted hours. Rain pelted us like sharp needles, and the waves rocked us so violently I thought we would capsize. Each lightning strike lit up the floating corpses, casting grotesque shadows across the deck. Lena screamed again, and Aisha pressed her closer to the cabin floor, whispering words I couldn't hear over the wind. By dawn, the storm passed, leaving the boat battered but afloat. We were soaked, shivering, exhausted, but alive. The bodies that had floated so close were now gone, carried away by the currents, leaving only the faint smell of salt and decay. We had survived the storm, but survival didn't mean safety. Our supplies were nearly gone, and the thought of going ashore again terrified me. Yet we had no choice. Water was almost gone, and Lena's cries of thirst haunted me more than the moans of the dead ever could. The next day, we spotted a small dock farther along the coastline, less destroyed than the harbor we had first visited. It was a gamble, but we needed the supplies. I steered us toward it cautiously, eyes scanning the water for movement. My father kept the crowbar ready, and Aisha clutched her medical bag, whispering calming words to Lena as she sat on the floor of the cabin. As we approached, we saw signs of life, smoke curling from chimneys, the distant sound of human voices. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps there were still pockets of survivors, people who hadn't been overtaken by panic or the dead. But as we tied the boat to the dock, we realized we weren't alone. Shadows moved along the pier, and figures appeared at the edge of the dock. Not the dead this time, but humans. Their eyes were desperate, hungry, and wild. They wanted what we had. One of them stepped forward, hands raised, trying to seem harmless. "Please," he said, voice shaking. "We need food and water. We don't have anything left. Please, just a little." I gripped the boat hook tighter. "Back off," I said firmly. "We have just enough for ourselves." The man's face twisted in anger. His companions closed in, 3 more now stepping from the shadows. They were armed with makeshift weapons, pipes, knives, and boards with nails. My father raised his crowbar. "We warned you," he said, his voice low and steady. Then it happened. One of them lunged at the boat, trying to grab a crate of supplies. My father swung the crowbar, striking him across the shoulder. He howled, stumbling back, but the others didn't stop. I thrust the boat hook forward, catching another in the chest and pushing him back into the railing. Aisha shouted, hitting one with a metal rod she had picked up from the cabin. Lena clung to her mother, wide-eyed and trembling. The fight was chaos. Bodies collided, weapons clanged against the boat's hull, and the water splashed over the sides as the attackers tried to board. One fell overboard, thrashing and coughing, only to be dragged under by the weight of his own panic. Another scrambled back to the dock, limping, blood streaking his arm. Within minutes, the remaining attackers retreated, disappearing into the shadows of the dock. We collapsed on the deck, gasping for breath, muscles trembling from exertion and fear. My father wiped his brow, crowbar resting across his knees. Aisha hugged Lena, whispering soothing words. I stared at the horizon, realizing that the world had changed completely. The dead were dangerous, yes, but the living were equally unpredictable, equally threatening. That night, as the boat rocked gently on calmer waters, I sat at the tiller and looked at my family. We were battered, exhausted, and scared, but we were together. And that had to be enough. I knew the coming days would test us even more. Storms, hunger, the dead, and the living, but as long as we had each other, we would find a way. The world outside had fallen apart, but inside this small boat, we still had a chance. The days after the fight at the dock were tense but quiet. We stayed well offshore, drifting slowly along the coastline, eyes scanning the water for any sign of the dead, or the desperate humans who had tried to take our supplies. Each morning I checked the fuel and food, calculating how long we could last, while my father repaired minor damage to the railings and reinforced the boat wherever possible. Aisha tended to our minor injuries and made sure Lena ate, even if it was only a few bites. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-orange streaks, I turned on the small radio we'd salvaged from home. I hadn't dared use it much, afraid the static and broken broadcasts would bring more panic than comfort. But the hum of static was strangely comforting, a reminder that somewhere, the world was still alive. And then, a voice came through, crisp, clear, and unexpectedly calm. Attention all survivors. A vaccine has been developed and is currently being distributed in secure zones. Evacuation points are being established along the coast. If you can reach them safely, assistance is available. Repeat. A vaccine has been developed. Help is available at designated evacuation sites. I froze. The words echoed in my ears. A vaccine. Help. The first real glimmer of hope we'd had in weeks. Father, are you listening?" Aisha whispered from behind, her hand on my shoulder. Lena peeked from behind her mother, wide-eyed. "I heard it," I said, my voice shaking. My heart pounded with a mix of relief and fear. Relief that hope existed, and fear because reaching shore safely would still be a battle. We spent the night planning. The vaccine zones were along the eastern coastline, several kilometers from where we floated. It wouldn't be easy. The dead still drifted in the waters, the city was chaos incarnate, and the other humans. Well, we had learned they could be just as dangerous. But for the first time, we had direction, a goal beyond mere survival. At first light, we set a course toward one of the evacuation points mentioned in the broadcast. The water was calm, and the early morning mist gave us a fleeting sense of privacy. My father stayed at the bow with the harpoon, scanning for threats. I kept the wheel, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Aisha and Lena remained below deck, trying to eat a small breakfast of rice and beans. Hours passed. The horizon remained empty, the only sounds the slap of waves against the hull and the creak of the boat. We dared to hope we might make it without incident. Then, movement on the water. Small splashes, distant but deliberate. I raised my binoculars and froze. A cluster of figures, floating and moving unnaturally, drifted toward us. Not far, and gaining speed with each wave. The dead. "Get ready," I said, my voice tight. My father's crowbar gleamed in the morning light. Aisha gripped the cabin door, holding Lena close. The figures neared, moaning faintly through the mist. I could see the torn flesh, the blank eyes, the jerky movements. We fought as we had before, crowbar, harpoon, boat hook, driving them back, pushing them under, keeping the deck clear. Waves tossed bodies overboard, and each time one resurfaced, we struck again. Lena screamed once, but Aisha held her tight, whispering words of comfort and courage. By mid-morning, the last of the dead had drifted past, their moans fading into the mist. We were exhausted, bruised, and soaked in saltwater and grime, but we were alive. And now, the promise of the vaccine drove us forward. For the next few days, we navigated carefully along the coastline, avoiding debris, scouting for threats, and rationing what little supplies remained. Every glance toward the horizon was a mixture of hope and fear. We saw smoke from fires, but fewer people. Signs of chaos were everywhere, yet the thought of a secure evacuation point kept us moving. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sea gold, we saw it, a cluster of boats anchored near a fortified dock, flags fluttering to mark the safe zone. My hands shook on the wheel. My heart surged. We had made it. After weeks of running, hiding, fighting, and surviving, there was finally a light at the end of the nightmare. We anchored a safe distance away, just as we had done before, and assessed the dock. Guards patrolled with weapons, keeping the dead and desperate humans at bay. The thought of finally stepping ashore and reaching the vaccine made me almost forget the fear, almost forget the exhaustion. Almost. Aisha held Lena's hand. My father checked our supplies and weapons. I took a deep breath, gripping the wheel. Together, we had survived the city, the dead, the desperate, storms, hunger, and fear itself. And now, for the first time, survival had a purpose beyond mere endurance. The safe zone was close. The vaccine was real. Hope was alive. And as we prepared to make our final approach, I allowed myself a fleeting, unguarded smile. We were still here. We were still together. And for the first time in weeks, I truly believed we would survive. The morning was still, the sea almost unnaturally calm. The safe zone glimmered ahead like a promise, a cluster of anchored boats and a fortified dock beyond them. My hands trembled on the wheel, not from fear this time, but from anticipation. Weeks of terror, exhaustion, and endless uncertainty had led to this moment. If we could just reach that dock, the vaccine would be ours. I kept a tight hold on the tiller, scanning for any movement in the water. My father was at the bow, harpoon ready, eyes flicking from the horizon to the approaching dock. Aisha held Lena close below deck, whispering softly to calm her daughter, though the child's wide eyes betrayed both fear and excitement. The approach was tense. Other survivors moved along the dock, some carrying weapons, others helping boats to tie up. Guards patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders, scanning the water for signs of trouble. Every splash, every ripple seemed magnified in my mind. Weeks of watching, fighting, and surviving had made me jumpy, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. As we drew closer, a horn sounded, a warning, or perhaps a signal that we were nearing. I eased the engine, guiding our boat with painstaking care. My father's hand was steady on the rail, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. Even after everything we'd survived, the instinct to fight, to protect, was impossible to suppress. "Keep her steady," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but every word carried weight. I nodded. "Almost there," I muttered, though my throat was dry. We reached the line of anchored boats. One of the guards waved, signaling us to stop a safe distance away. I cut the engine and let the waves push us gently toward the dock. The smell of the sea mixed with smoke and faint food aromas from the safe zone. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine normalcy, warm meals, clean water, and medicine that worked. A small boat was dispatched to guide us in. The oars slapped the water, moving swiftly and silently. When it reached our side, a guard jumped aboard with surprising ease, holding a hand out. "You'll be fine," he said simply, though his eyes betrayed caution. "Follow our instructions. Stay together." I nodded, relief flooding through me, but still tight with vigilance. Weeks at sea, fighting the dead and the living, had left an imprint. Trust would not come easily. We followed the guard's instructions, tying our boat to the designated post. My father helped Aisha and Lena step onto the dock first. Their feet touched solid ground after weeks on water, and I felt a jolt of emotion. Lena looked around with wide eyes, the first real expression of wonder and relief I'd seen in her since the outbreak began. The dock was busy but organized. Other survivors moved with purpose, guided by guards who seemed to have some semblance of order. We were ushered toward a checkpoint where our supplies were quickly inspected. The guards didn't take anything, but they made sure we had no dangerous weapons or contaminated materials. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders as I realized that, for once, we were not under immediate threat. After the inspection, we were led to a waiting area. Families huddled together, some crying, others staring blankly. The contrast to the chaos of the city was almost surreal. Aisha held Lena's hand tightly, whispering soft reassurances, while my father and I took a moment to catch our breath. Then came the news, louder than any broadcast, clearer than any radio signal. A nurse stepped forward, handing out instructions for vaccination. Our names were called. Relief flooded me like the tide. Weeks of fighting, hiding, surviving, and navigating the treacherous waters had led to this moment. The vaccine was real. Help was real. Lena's small hand squeezed mine as we approached. Aisha kept one arm around her, the other holding onto the bag of medical supplies. My father walked with a steady gait, though his face betrayed the toll of the past weeks. The nurse gave quick instructions, and soon the four of us received the first dose. Relief was immediate, though cautious. We weren't completely safe yet, but this was a turning point, the first step toward reclaiming our lives. As we walked away from the distribution area, I looked back at the boats bobbing in the water, the dock now bustling with organized activity. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a smile. The nightmare that had consumed our world hadn't broken us. We were battered, scarred, and exhausted, but we had survived. Together. I glanced at my family, Aisha, Lena, and my father, and felt a surge of gratitude. Against the dead, the desperate, the storms, and the chaos, we had made it. The vaccine was a symbol, yes, but it was also a promise. A promise that the world could begin to heal, and that our story didn't have to end in fear. For the first time, I let myself believe that we had a future beyond the boat, beyond survival. And as we stepped fully onto solid ground, surrounded by others who had also endured, I knew that we were finally, truly, alive. The first night in the safe zone felt unreal. After weeks of constant danger, the quiet was almost oppressive. The dock had been bustling when we arrived, but now it was calm, with lanterns casting a soft glow across the water and small tents providing shelter for survivors. The smell of cooked food, clean water, and disinfectant hit me like a punch, luxuries I hadn't even remembered existed. We were assigned a small cabin near the edge of the zone, just big enough for the four of us. Lena's eyes grew wide as she stepped inside. She ran her fingers along the wooden bunk, touching the blankets as if to make sure they were real. Aisha helped her wash up, and I leaned against the door frame, taking it all in. For the first time in weeks, I didn't have to be on guard. The city and the dead were behind us. The other humans, the desperate who had tried to take our supplies, gone, or at least out of reach. And the vaccine. The vaccine meant we could finally breathe. Sleep came in short bursts that night. I woke often, checking the windows, listening for any sounds of disturbance, my mind still trapped in the survival mode that had carried me through so much. My father slept in the corner, still restless, crowbar at hand just in case. Aisha and Lena finally slept soundly, exhausted by the sudden relief and weeks of tension. Morning brought the first proper meal we'd had in days. Warm bread, soup, and fresh water. Lena's laughter, small but genuine, echoed through the cabin as she ate. Aisha smiled, her eyes still tired but brighter than they had been in weeks. My father grunted in approval at the meal, nibbling quietly. For a moment, we allowed ourselves to forget the chaos outside. After breakfast, we were escorted to a communal area where other survivors gathered. People shared stories of the city, tales of survival, of fights against the infected, of loved ones lost. It was both horrifying and comforting. Horrifying because of the sheer scale of the devastation, comforting because it reminded me that we were not alone. The safe zone had rules, and the guards enforced them firmly. Everyone contributed to the community, sharing labor, food, and skills. My father immediately found a place helping repair boats and maintain the dock, his metalworking skills invaluable. I joined the fishermen and boatmen, assisting in checking nets, maintaining engines, and teaching others about navigating the waters safely. Aisha offered her nursing expertise, helping tend to injuries and sickness among the survivors. Lena, after a few hesitant days, began playing with other children in the zone, laughter slowly returning to her life. Even in the safety of the zone, tension lingered. News of outbreaks outside the perimeter reminded us that danger was never far away. There were occasional alerts, small packs of the infected approaching the outskirts, but the guards and fortifications kept them at bay. Each time, I felt a surge of protective instinct, a reminder that even here, survival required vigilance. One afternoon, while helping my father reinforce a section of the dock, a new group of survivors arrived. They were exhausted, starving, and some carried injuries. My father's stern expression softened as he offered guidance and help, while I assisted in getting them settled and checking their supplies. Aisha treated the wounded with calm efficiency, her presence a source of reassurance to everyone. That evening, we gathered near the water's edge, watching the sun set over the calm sea. The horizon was no longer filled with smoke or chaos, but a peaceful glow. Lena rested her head on my shoulder, tired but happy. Aisha held her hand, and my father stood nearby, gazing at the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to hope, not just for survival, but for a future. The vaccine meant we could rebuild, the safe zone offered security, and our family. We were together. The world outside had been destroyed, but here, we had the chance to heal. I realized then that survival was no longer just about avoiding death. It was about living again, about finding moments of peace and connection amidst the ruins. And as night fell, I felt a cautious optimism. We had survived the dead, the desperate, the storms, and the chaos. Now, we could survive ourselves, and maybe, just maybe, thrive once more. Life in the safe zone was a fragile rhythm, a delicate balance between relief and lingering fear. The first few weeks had been a mixture of exhaustion, cautious optimism, and the slow return of routines we had long forgotten. We woke with the sun, ate proper meals, tended to our responsibilities, and tried to reclaim pieces of normalcy. Yet the shadows of the past weeks never fully left us. Every sound, every ripple on the water, every unfamiliar face kept me alert, fingers twitching near the crowbar or boat hook. The first real challenge came not from the dead, nor from the storms, but from the people who had survived alongside us. A group of survivors, recently arrived from a neighboring town, brought tension into the community. They were desperate, thin, and suspicious, eyes darting constantly as if expecting betrayal. Their leader, a tall man with a harsh voice and a scar across his cheek, claimed they had been robbed at every stop and expected the same treatment here. On the morning he approached me, I was checking the nets at the dock. He stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes cold. "You've been here long enough," he said. "I know you've scavenged supplies. Don't think we don't notice. Share what you have, or there'll be consequences." My chest tightened. I remembered the attack at the dock, the desperation of those men who had tried to take our supplies. I didn't trust him, but I couldn't risk an outright fight in the heart of the safe zone. "We're all struggling," I said evenly. "We'll help, but there's only so much to go around. Everyone here has to contribute." He sneered. "Contribute? You've got a boat, food, and weapons. You've got more than your share." Before I could respond, my father appeared, crowbar at the ready, standing beside me. His presence alone made the man hesitate. "We've survived by working together, not stealing from others," my father said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority. "Try anything foolish, and you'll regret it." The man backed down, at least for the moment, but the tension lingered. For days afterward, I watched them closely, wary of every movement, every whispered conversation. The safe zone was a sanctuary, yes, but human nature was unpredictable, and desperation could turn anyone into a threat. Meanwhile, life for Aisha and Lena slowly improved. Aisha had been given a small medical station to help tend to minor injuries and illness, which kept her busy and gave her a sense of purpose. Lena had found a group of children her age, playing near the docks under careful supervision. Their laughter was a fragile thread connecting her back to the world she should have known, a childhood not overshadowed by fear and survival. Even with the vaccine and relative safety, I couldn't shake the memories of the past weeks. Nights were the worst, when silence replaced the constant noise of survival. I would lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling of our cabin, listening for sounds that no longer posed a threat, until the phantom screams, the imagined splashes, reminded me how close we had come to losing everything. One afternoon, while helping repair a fishing net near the edge of the dock, I noticed a small boat drifting too close to the safe zone perimeter. Smoke curled faintly from the shore beyond, and I could see figures moving unnaturally through the water. The dead. A wave of unease ran through me. Even here, in this haven, the remnants of chaos were never far. I alerted the guards immediately. They moved quickly, organizing a defensive line, and the intruders were kept at bay. Watching from the dock, I felt both relief and lingering dread. The safe zone was a sanctuary, but it was not impervious. Threats, dead, desperate humans, or nature itself, could arrive without warning. That night, as I sat at the edge of the dock, Lena asleep in Aisha's arms, I allowed myself a small measure of reflection. We had endured more than most could imagine: chaos in the city, attacks from the dead and the living, storms at sea, and weeks of hunger and fear. And yet, we were still here. We had survived. But survival alone wasn't enough anymore. The safe zone offered security, but living fully, rebuilding, and reclaiming a sense of purpose would be the next challenge. I realized that the fight had not ended, it had simply changed. I glanced at my father, quietly reinforcing a section of the dock, and then at Aisha and Lena. Together, we had faced the worst the world could throw at us. Together, we would face what came next. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that the future, though uncertain, might still hold hope. The weeks that followed were slower, quieter, and for the first time, almost ordinary. The safe zone became a place not just for survival, but for living. My father's skills as a metalworker were in constant demand, reinforcing docks, repairing boats, and crafting tools for the community. I worked alongside him, teaching other fishermen how to navigate the waters safely, how to identify threats, and how to prepare for storms. Aisha thrived in the medical station, her calm efficiency and compassion making her a pillar of trust in the community. And Lena finally laughed freely again, her small hands painting, playing with other children, and running along the dock without fear. The tension of the early days never completely disappeared. Rumors of infected pockets beyond the safe zone occasionally reached us, and disputes among survivors flared from time to time. But compared to the chaos we had fled, the city ablaze, the dead everywhere, the desperate humans attacking for supplies, the safe zone felt like a sanctuary carved out of the apocalypse itself. One morning, as I checked the nets with my father, a radio broadcast crackled to life. This time, it wasn't just a warning or a piece of guidance, it was news of hope. Distribution of the vaccine has expanded. Safe zones are increasing. Survivors are rebuilding communities. We are seeing signs of recovery. I let the sound wash over me, a wave of relief and disbelief. I looked at my family, each of us hardened by the horrors we'd endured, yet softened by the rare and precious gift of safety. Lena tugged at my sleeve, pointing at the horizon. "Look, Papa, the sun!" she exclaimed. Her voice was bright, filled with wonder rather than fear. And indeed, the sun rose over the calm waters, its golden light reflecting across the docks, the boats, and the small community bustling below. I breathed deeply, letting the warmth fill me. Weeks ago, the world had ended for us. Now, it felt like we had a chance to start again. To live, to laugh, to rebuild, to heal. Aisha squeezed my hand, and I nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of all we had survived together. My father gave a small, rare smile, the crowbar at his side forgotten for the moment. Lena danced across the dock, her laughter echoing like music I never thought I'd hear again. We had endured the dead, the desperate, the storms, and the chaos. We had faced impossible choices, fought for every scrap of survival, and clung to each other through nights of terror and despair. And now, we stood together, alive, unbroken, and hopeful. The world outside was still dangerous, still uncertain, but we had each other. We had survived, and that, I realized, was more than enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to look forward, to dream of a future where my family was safe, where the ocean could once again be a place of livelihood rather than fear, and where life, fragile and precious, could continue. We were survivors, and the world, little by little, would follow.